Hello, everyone. Thank you for watching this special episode of Really Dicey. This is Manny, and I'm here with.
Chris McDowall, designer of Into the Odd, Electric Bastionland, and the upcoming Mythic Bastionland.
Yes, yes. My friends and I are big fans of this book,
Oh yeah,
and when I heard you were doing something with that theme, that setting again, I really want to talk to you about it and hear what you have planned coming up. So yes, Mythic Bastionland is going to be your latest Kickstarter project, crowdfunding project, right?
yeah. So it's going to be going on Kickstarter 7th of November this year. Obviously, so about 3 weeks from now. Well, three
Wow.
weeks from the point that we're talking. Sorry, I should say. Um, and yeah, it's a follow up to Into the Odd and Electric Bastionland, which I previously did. So all these three all use kind of the same system, but this one is a little bit more different than I've done before. So the general principle of it is Into the Odd was my kind of attempt to make like the dungeon crawling game that I really wanted. And then when I did Electric Bastion, that was kind of, well, my kind of take on like a city game. And Mythic Bastionland is all about the wilderness and kind of like hex crawling and that whole kind of style of play. So yeah, it's kind of like it's just exploring like a slightly different avenue of kind of play in that system.
Hmm. And if I may ask, what led you to create this project?
So it kind of these things always kind of come out of necessity, really, because I knew that I had, like I say, I had the system that I really enjoyed in Into the Odd and Electric Bastionland, but I did feel like I wanted to explore that kind of wilderness thing more, and it's a massive cliche, but during lockdown, we spent a lot of time walking in the wilderness, frankly, and seeing a lot of like nature around us because obviously we were limited in what we could do. Um, and that sort of sparked it off initially, this kind of like wanting to make a game that lent more into like nature and wilderness rather than the very kind of industrial urban feel of like Into the Odd and Electric Bastionland. So the natural kind of way to go with it felt to look to the past of that setting. So this is set within like the mythic past of that world. So it's kind of early medieval, like Arthurian inspired, bits of like British folklore in there, um, drawing on all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's a bit of a mash of ideas, but essentially I wanted to make a game that I could use to really kind of dig into that hex crawling wilderness style of play.
Hmm. Now, I couldn't help to notice that as I'm looking through the quick start that you sent me earlier,
Hmm.
um, so the Green Knight by
Yeah,
A24 is a wonderful dark movie, a fantastic movie. I recommend it anyone that likes I don't know how you would describe like a surreal but real
yeah, yeah.
Arthurian legend, And I've been looking for a system to play with it, and I'm looking at this. I'm like, oh, um, this is I think what I'm looking for to set something like that up. Did that movie inspire you to make this? Did the other sources inspire you to make this?
Yeah, so I mean, I was already familiar with the original like poem that it's based on, and the whole different versions of the Green Knight story that have sort of come out across the centuries, I guess. But that was really good because that came out here at a really pivotal time in this project where I was right in the middle of I'd been working on the game for a while, and I had been drawing on like lots of Arthurian stuff before because I'd kind of been dipping into that for the last couple of years. But that film in particular, yeah, was really it felt at a really good time for me because it really kind of helped me kind of it's a good little reference point to point to people to say like yeah sometimes you can think of like Arthurian myth as this very kind of stuffy, very very formal, like I mean it is old fashioned because it is, but like something that's just kind of boring. But I like all that weird stuff that's in there and all the kind of like dreamlike weird imagery that's there. Um, and that's always something I wanted to project into the book. And I think the artwork is a huge part of that. Obviously, the words have their part, but having a really good illustration really helps. So I think the artwork that we've got coming in is definitely tapping into that style as well. But yeah, that's a great sort of touchstone for people if they're not as familiar with like all the Arthurian stuff. That film is a really good place to start.
Mm. And let's talk a little bit about the artwork. I know you just mentioned it previously.
Hmm.
Tell us about the direction. This looks really. Really interesting. What made you decide to go in this direction? I know you're using a different artist than from Into the Odd.
Yeah, so it's a different artist from. So for Into the Yard, Johan Nur did all of the artwork. But for Electric Bastionland previously, I mean, I can. It's these pieces that are on my wall here. For Electric Bastionland, that was Alex Sorensen, and he's come back to do this one as well. So I wanted to have the dream was always to have Alec do this, but I just had to make sure that the schedule was lined up. But we've managed to make it work, and yeah. So in terms of the direction, I'm really impressed that he's managed to do it because I feel like I gave him a really difficult brief, which was saying that yeah, I want it to feel. I was like the worst person because I was like, I want it to feel like kind of it feels like real and it could be grounded, but also it's kind of a bit surreal and dreamlike. And saying like, oh, I want it to kind of evoke the feeling of like stained glass windows and also kind of evoke the feeling of like tapestry to get that kind of medieval feel. And I couldn't quite picture how this would look. I was just like saying words and probably making his life hell for this pitch by saying so many contradictory things. But somehow I feel like he's managed to do that really well. Like there are bits of it that do have that kind of stained glass, kind of very flat kind of structure to it, I guess. And the palette really helps get that kind of feel of like it looks like it could be a tapestry. It could be made out of cloth. So yeah, it took us a while to get there because there was a lot of sort of drafting and showing pieces and saying which ones work best. But I think we're at a place now that looks really good, and I'm really happy with it.
What would you say is the overall story slash setting of this world? Is there a set of I guess you could say heroes and villains? Is there anything like that?
Yeah, so every character in this game is going to be a knight of some sort, and there are 72 in the book, and these are kind of like the starting packages from Into the Odd or the failed careers from Electric Bastionland, where it is a class of a sort because it gives you like some starting stuff for your character, but then you're kind of set free to do what you want with that. So you might be the Talon Knight who has a bird that they can sort of telepathically share a link with, or you might be the True Knight who has their thing where they can like punish people who are lying. They can sort of sense lies almost. And there's 72 of these knights. Each of you will be a different knight together in a company. And the idea is you're seeking glory. So you're hex crawling around the realm. And the way to get glory is by seeking out these myths. So on the opposite side of each spread to each knight, there is a myth, which is a set of 6 omens that will sort of unfold as you encounter this myth. And it could be like the wyvern or the forest or the goblin. They're all very like singular things that are kind of emerging in the realm. And you'll be kind of picking apart multiple of these myths at the time, kind of going through down different paths as you kind of go around the realm. So yeah, it does have what I wanted to do is I wanted to have that feeling of something like it feels like a story from like mythology, where it's like these very archetypal characters going through this journey, but I didn't want it to feel like the GM had to sit down and learn like loads of mythology. So they do kind of just emerge kind of procedurally almost as you go around. There's a little bit of prep at the start of the game when you're kind of mapping the realm, but then after that, the omens just kind of happen and they kind of create the myths. So my intent is to make something that has that mythic feel, but doesn't rely on a lot of kind of preparation and like memorization by the GM.
So just to go back a little bit, did you say 72 types of knights? Wow.
72 different knights, yeah. So there's 12 in the quick starts. There's 72 in the final book and 72 myths as well. So you'll start the game with like 6 myths that are kind of active in your realm. So there should be enough to keep people going for a while.
So is that okay? So that explains. So I'm looking through your quick story and I see the Barb Knight, for example, and then right after it, the Worm. So they're not together per se. It's just
no, and that's something that I went back and forth on because originally I did have them feel a little bit more connected. So it was almost like each spread was like a story. So it would be like the Barbed Knight and the Worm, like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. But I wanted to keep some of that, so it still had a little bit of that storybook feel. But you can use the myths that are related to the knights that the players have, but you don't have to. You're generally going to just pick some at random. So it's left open, and but I still wanted it to have that kind of feel of like each spread feeling almost like if you look at the elements, you could kind of piece together a story in your head for how these two things might sort of oppose each other.
Hmm. And what can you tell us about the rules for the game? Is it similar to your previous works?
Yeah, so it uses the same basic system as Into the Odd. You know, we've got three ability scores. Things are renamed a bit to suit the setting a bit better, but it's kind of the same basic system. You've still got combat where you don't roll to hit; you just roll damage. Again, there's some little. I was very careful because every time I make a new game, people will say to me as a joke, "Oh, is this going to be advanced Into the Odd?" Like, because Into the Odd is very rules light, and I want to keep it that way. But for this one, I did add in a few more little bits and pieces to combat to make it feel like a little bit more, because the knights are kind of innately going to have some kind of martial ability compared to like the weirdos that you get Into the Odd, where you're some treasure hunter that's like opportunistic and you might not have any combat skill. I wanted the knights to feel a little bit more like you had some combat sort of toys to play with almost. So there's a bit more of an expanded system there, and then there are rule systems for things like hex crawling, domain management, sort of time passing. But I wanted them all to be very simple and very straightforward, because I always love the idea of doing that big campaign where you have domain management and you're going through like generations of play, and you're going through the seasons and stuff, and dealing with like wars and battles. But I don't like lots and lots of rules. So I've tried to get all that stuff to fit into the kind of Into the Odd style of like very light, very quick rules. So there's lots of rules in there, but they're packed into quite a nice, tight little rule set.
Hmm. And just like your other books, they're self-contained. You just need just dice, paper, and pen.
Yeah, so you don't need anything fancy. There's just you just need your dice, paper, pen, and it is a standalone. So it does. You could use it with stuff from Into the Odd and stuff from Electric Bastionland, but if you don't have those two games or you don't have any interest in those two games, you could just use this absolutely on its own. It could exist without those other two things existing.
Hmm. So it sounds like you can create all sorts of different stories and mythology out of this. What would you? I'm sure. I mean, you play tested this. Has there been any combination or story that you made that you were surprised by from this?
It's interesting because the thing with when I'm writing the myths, so each of the myths kind of has, so say it's like the worm, which we talked about, which is like this big kind of giant serpent that like is a horrible a horrible monster. The omens might start like number one is there's like rumors of the worm in, and then omen two might be that you encounter some like devastation left behind by the worm, and you kind of gradually the worm itself will kind of gradually kind of unfold. And what's interesting is what I hadn't really thought about before I tested it was the fact that the players wouldn't know what the myth was, because I know that the myth is the worm, but they don't know that. So they only see the myth. So they will find like this site of devastation and they don't know what it was. And people will be talking about like, they'll be talking about a monster that had done this. But then they might encounter an omen from a different myth and they don't know that these two aren't connected. So that it's really interesting because when I write them, they feel very kind of contained and linear. But then when you put them into the game, all the different myths within the realm kind of cross over a little bit and you get this weird cross-pollination. So the one that comes to mind is one of the first play tests I did. We had a myth that was the plague, which is one of the first ones in the book. And we had a myth that was the dead, which is like the dead are rising up. And you don't have to use those two together, but in using those two together, the players I was playing with naturally kind of assumed that this plague that they were hearing about and these skeletons and zombies that were rising out of the ground were like connected. So they were like, oh, these people are suffering from plague. We need to make sure they don't raise as zombies afterwards, which then turned out to not be the case. And they realized they were two separate things. But yeah, it's the combinations that I found really interesting, and they can create some really kind of fun moments.
Will the final product be similar to the size of Into the Odd or your previous works?
It will be the same size as Electric Bastionland. So that's going to be letter size. So slightly squatter and slightly wider than A4. It's going to be around 200 and just less than 250 pages, I think. So slightly slimmer than Electric Bastionland, but weirdly, it's going to be slightly slimmer, but it's going to have more words and more art. So I'm not quite sure how I've managed that. but it's going to be a bigger and smaller book in both ways.
Hmm. So let's talk about the Kickstarter campaign. I'm
Sure.
assuming it's Kickstarter. Um,
Yes, that's right.
what can you tell us about your plans for that so far?
So my sort of philosophy with Kickstarter is 100% about maintaining my own sanity, essentially. So what that means is by the time I press go on Kickstarter, the book is essentially written, at least in like a good draft. So there's going to be editing and stuff happening afterwards, but for the most part, the book is written. A good chunk of the art will be done, and the rest of it will be coming in as the kind of as the campaign runs and shortly afterwards. There are no stretch goals. There are no super high pledge tiers to get like extra fancy versions of it. What I really wanted to do is I want to just have the version of the book. And it's, if you want to buy Mythic Bastionland, this is Mythic Bastionland. And if there's anything I want to put in there, like color art or ribbons or nicer materials, I want that to be, I don't want that to be tied to the campaign, if that makes sense. I don't know. This is kind of this is terrible advice for anyone running a Kickstarter, because I think all those things do really help drive up like excitement and stuff. But for me, I just wanted to make like the version of the book that I wanted to make. So it's a very simple campaign, and it's going to be running for 30 days from November 7th.
Hmm. Just to go back a little bit, just so we were clear before. So
Sure.
it's very similar to your other works, where this is it's very rules light, but in a sense also like character creation. Character creation is quick.
Yeah.
Setting up campaigns is quick. It's very similar to your previous works in that way.
Yeah, and what I've always wanted to do, because I do love preparing for games as a referee. There's times when it feels like work if you're doing it under pressure or you're not feeling the game that you're going to be running. But in principle, I really love that. So I always want to try and put in my books like fun things that you can do during prep. Because the one thing that I always remember doing when I was like, especially when I was younger, was rolling up characters for games that I had no intention of playing, because I enjoyed the process of like rolling these characters and seeing what I got, and like stuff like Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay where there's lots of randomness. It was a lot of fun to do that. But prep often feels like work. So yeah, I've got quite a straightforward system for mapping the realm, sort of doing like a 12 by 12 hex map. And it's fun enough to do that I have just found myself making these maps just for fun, and populating them with myths and landmarks and holdings. And there's lots of little random tables in there for like generating the wilderness and characters, and even silly things like there's like a random water table that just affects like, it gives you like an inspiration of like, what does the water look like in this area? And that's something that's really helpful to me, because when you need those descriptions in the moment, sometimes all you need is just a few little words to sort of spark the imagination. So there's lots of little things like that. So yeah, I wanted to make prepping the game really fun, and I just wanted to have lots of those little toolkit things feel not overwhelming and feel like you
Hmm.
could just dip into them and try them out. And it was very accessible if you're not necessarily someone who's prepared a million campaigns across your life.
Hmm. So one last question. Um, so hundreds of stories are being written every day, but Arthurian legends are here to stay. We always see some sort of a adaptation of some sort every couple of years. What is it do you think about these myths about knights of old that seem to intrigue us still to this day?
This is one of the things that really interests me about it. So there's not really like one version of the King Arthur story that I like especially love. But the thing that I found really interesting when I was researching it was how how throughout like history, like the myth has been changed and altered to suit different people's like agenda, and the way it's moved into different cultures. So how it's moved across like Northern Europe and France, and like how that version is different to the version sort of more associated with Britain. Um, so I think the fact that there's been lots of attempts to make like a canon and say no, this is how it works, this is how the myth works. It really resists there being a canon, because for everything you can say like, oh, Arthur was born in Tintagel, there is a version somewhere that says, no, 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 he was born somewhere else. And for every version that says, oh, Merlin, he's like a half demon, there'll be another version saying, no, actually, he's this, or actually, he's this. So I really like that it has these characters that we think of as like super like archetypal characters that are like really defined, but you can find so many different versions of them. I guess it's a cliche, but it's kind of like the comic book characters, I guess, of today, where like there's no one version of like Spider-Man, and it's fun to look at all the different ways that people have interpreted that character. So yeah, I think the fact that you kind of can't really do it wrong, and that especially for RPGs, I think that kind of setting is really appealing, because doing it wrong is always something that scares me when I'm running like a licensed setting or like an existing IP. So so the fact that you can't do it wrong is great.
Is there anything else about this project that I haven't asked about that you wanted to share?
I think we've mainly talked about all the big things. The other thing that I did kind of touch on is this idea of the other thing that I wanted to put in there is I was always really drawn to the idea of the Great Pendragon campaign. This kind of huge campaign that you can run in Pendragon that spans like 200 years, I think. And the whole point of it is that, well, your first character is not going to survive this campaign, so you're going to have to establish an heir, and then your character will grow old and eventually die, and then you'll have the next generation. And I liked that, but the reality is I'm never going to play a campaign that long, just because I can't make a campaign last that long. I can make a campaign last maybe 10 sessions if I get everyone organized, but it's not going to go that long. So I wanted to squeeze some of that into like a smaller scope. So you have got a system for the advancement of time in the game, whether it's moving to new seasons and how that affects the realm, or moving to like a new age. And the thing that's very telling is in the two really famous games that have aging, which I think are Pendragon and Traveller, probably. In both those games, which I've sort of dipped into recently, they both have the kind of the point where your body you start peaking and you start declining is around the late 30s, which is where I am right now. So in this game, there's no sort of it's left very broad, but you start off as young, you're a young knight, and then you become a mature knight, and that's when you hit your peak, and then you will become an old knight, because I think everyone wants to think that they are in that mature group rather than the old group. So for the people who are hitting the normal decline in RPGs, it's very appealing to have that in there. But yeah, I wanted to have that be very simple and straightforward and fast, so that you can have a kind of generational style play in a relatively short campaign.
Excellent. Well, Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about your latest project, Mythic Bastionland.
Yeah, that's right.
Again, it'll be out Kickstarter November 7th.
That's right.
And yeah, I'll put a link in the description below.
Great.
Thank you everyone for watching. Stay safe out there. We'll see you next time.
Cheers.